They hired her because no one else would. A woman with no family, no background, no one to vouch for her, stepping off a dusty train into a dying farm under the Texas sun. The cattle were emaciated, the wells were dry, and the farm owner, Sem, a proud man losing everything, looked at her as if she were a mistake he hadn't yet made. But Clara Boone didn't come here to be welcomed. She came because she saw something no one else saw, and that something would change everything. If you love stories about women abandoned by the world but still standing strong, hit like now, subscribe to the channel, and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has come. Don't miss the ending. That's where everything changes completely. The stage stop at Harlow, Texas was not much more than a water trough, a hitching post, and a man with a drooping mustache who charged a nickel for the privilege of standing in his shade. Clara Boone paid the nickel. She was not going to stand in the sun if she didn't have to. She'd been on the coach for 11 hours. Her back ached in a way that made her want to press both fists into her lumbar and just stand there, eyes closed, until the feeling sorted itself out. She did not do that because there were 3 men sitting on the porch of the stage stop watching her with the particular unhurried interest of people who had nothing better to do and no shame about it. The advertisement had come through the labor board in Abilene. She'd read it twice, folded it into her coat pocket, and read it again that night in a rented room above the laundry. Ranch hand needed. Redstone Ranch, Harlow County. Hard work. Fair wage. No references required. That last part was what convinced her. No references required meant they were either desperate or they didn't care about her history. Either way, it was the first door that had opened to her in 8 months. She had 2 bags. One held her clothes, a worn pair of work gloves, and a small tin of salve for cracked hands. The other held her father's notebooks. 3 of them, water-stained and soft at the corners, filled with his cramped handwriting and his drawings of land formations, drainage patterns, soil composition, and the 100 other things Harlan Boone had believed the earth was always trying to tell you, if you were quiet enough to listen. She hadn't decided yet whether she believed that, but she'd kept the notebooks. The man who came to collect her was not Cole Mercer. He was a ranch hand named Dub Garrett, sun-darkened to the color of old leather, with squinting eyes and the posture of someone who had given up on good posture some years ago and made peace with it. He drove a wagon that had lost one of its sideboards. He did not offer to help with her bags. "You the one who answered the posting?" he said. "Clara Boone." He looked at her the way people sometimes did, taking inventory, measuring, arriving at some judgment he didn't bother to conceal. She was a large woman. She had been her whole life. She had stopped waiting for people not to notice. "Uh-huh," Dub said. "Mercer know you're a woman?" The posting didn't specify a preference. He scratched the back of his neck. "No, I suppose it didn't." He climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Well, throw your bags in the back." She threw her bags in the back and climbed up beside him without waiting to be invited. The road to Redstone Ranch took 40 minutes and covered terrain that told a story without any narration. She could see where the grass had gone yellow and brittle at the roots, not just from heat, but from something deeper, a dryness that had been building for a while. The creek bed they crossed held maybe 4 inches of brown water where there should have been 2 feet of clear. She noted the way the soil cracked along the banks, the particular pattern of it, the way the edges curled up like burned paper. Her father would have stopped the wagon and crouched down and touched it. She kept her hands in her lap and looked. "How long has it been like this?" she asked. Dub didn't look at her. "Like what?" "Dry. Same as everywhere. It's worse here than it was back toward Abilene." He was quiet for a moment. "Going on 2 seasons now. Maybe more. Has the water table been tested?" That made him look at her. "What?" "The underground water. Has anyone gone down to check the depth of the—" "Lady," he said, not unkindly but firmly, "I drive the wagon. I don't do the testing." She let it go. Redstone Ranch announced itself first by the smell. Dry hay, animal waste, and beneath that something faintly chemical that she couldn't immediately name. Then the main gate came into view, made from 2 upright posts of weathered cedar with a crossbar hanging above. The name Redstone burned into the wood. One of the posts leaned about 8 degrees off vertical. The yard beyond the gate held a main house, a bunkhouse, 2 barns, a tool shed, and a corral where perhaps 30 cattle stood in the thin shade of a single cottonwood. 30 cattle for a ranch this size was not good. She counted the cattle twice to be sure. Then she counted the fence posts along the nearest pasture and did some rough arithmetic in her head about acreage. A man came out of the main house as the wagon pulled in. He was around 40, rangy, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for 20 years and showed it. Not ugly, but settled. The youth burned off, and what remained was something more durable. He wore a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he walked with a slight hitch in his left leg that he clearly tried not to favor but couldn't fully hide. He looked at her, then at Dub, then back at her. "Cole Mercer," he said. "Clara Boone." He nodded once. If he had a reaction to her appearance, he didn't put it anywhere visible. "You said in your letter you had range experience." "My father ran a small operation in the hill country for 18 years. I worked it with him from the time I was 9 until he passed." "Small operation." "Small, but we knew what we were doing." He studied her for a moment. Not dismissive, more like a man calibrating something. "The work here is hard. Harder than it should be right now because we're short on men and short on water, and the cattle are not doing what I need them to do." "I understand. Dub will show you the bunkhouse. We don't usually put women in the bunkhouse. I don't need special arrangements, Mr. Mercer. I need a cot and a place to wash up." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. "All right then." Mammed. The bunkhouse held 5 men at present, which meant 5 men who were now aware that she existed and had opinions about it. She could feel those opinions the moment she walked in. The way conversation stopped and then resumed in a different key, the careful way nobody looked directly at her. The 5 of them were Dub, whom she'd already met, a young man named Pezo who couldn't have been more than 19 and had a fresh scar along his jaw from some altercation he'd probably describe differently depending on who was asking. A middle-aged man named Hatch who had a cook's belly and a card-sharp's eyes. A quiet man called Birch who seemed to communicate primarily through sighs. And a wiry, red-headed man named Walt who introduced himself by saying, "Well, this ought to be interesting." "For both of us," Clara said, and set her bags on the empty cot in the far corner. She heard Walt say something low to Hatch. She did not hear what it was. She decided she probably didn't need to. The first 3 days were an education. She spent the morning of day 1 doing what she was told, moving feed, repairing a section of fence along the north pasture, helping shift the cattle from one grazing area to another. The work was physical, and she did it without complaint. She was stronger than she looked, which was something people always seemed surprised by, as though size and strength were unrelated. But while she worked, she watched. She watched the cattle, the way they moved, the way they gathered near the dry creek bed, even though there was no water there, pawing at the cracked earth. Animals went where water had been. It was instinct. The fact that they kept returning to that particular spot meant something. She watched the pasture land itself, the way the grass grew in uneven patches, thick in some areas, nearly absent in others, in a pattern that didn't quite match the topography. The low ground should have held more moisture. It wasn't. She watched the water troughs, which were filled each morning from a cistern behind the second barn. The cistern was fed by a hand pump connected to a well that Hatch told her had been dug 7 years ago. "Used to give good water," he said. "Last year it started coming up brown. Now it barely comes up at all." "Has anyone dug a second well?" Mercer tried. 18 months back. Came up dry. She asked where they dug. Hatch pointed to a spot near the east fence. She looked at it and looked at the lay of the land around it and filed the information away. On the evening of the second day, she walked the perimeter of the east pasture alone after supper. She was not supposed to do this. There was no rule against it. But she could feel Dub watching her from the bunkhouse doorway with the expression of a man watching someone do something he couldn't see the point of. The east pasture ended at a ridge, a low rocky formation maybe 12 feet high that ran roughly north to south for perhaps half a mile before curving back into the plain. Below the ridge on the ranch side, the grass was the worst she'd seen on the property. The soil had a grayish cast. She crouched down and picked up a handful and held it, feeling the texture, rolling it between her fingers. It was too fine, too compacted at the surface, like ground that had been wet and then dried very quickly, many times over. She looked at the base of the ridge. The rock formation was old sandstone, layered with the kind of fracturing that happened when water had once run through or under it. She found a spot where the grass grew in a thin green line along the base of the ridge, just a few feet of it, but visibly different from the burned yellow ground around it. Water was close there, not at the surface, but close. She pulled out one of her father's notebooks and sat down with her back against the ridge and drew a rough sketch of what she was seeing. Drainage pattern interrupted, she wrote beneath it. Check for subsurface obstruction along East Ridge Line. Grass pattern suggests channel blocked, not dried. Source may exist. She sat there for a while after she wrote it, looking at the sky going pink over the low hills to the west. A horned lizard moved across the rock face near her boot and paused, one eye finding her, and then moved on. She thought about her father. She thought about all the times he'd stood in some unremarkable piece of land and said, "Clara, the ground is talking. You just have to know the language." She'd rolled her eyes at him when she was 14. Later, when she was older, she'd understood that he hadn't been speaking metaphorically. He'd meant it precisely. The earth had a grammar, and if you learned to read it, it told you things. She stood up, brushed the dust off her trousers, and walked back to the bunkhouse. The confrontation happened on the morning of the fourth day, and she had been expecting it. She was in the smaller barn, mucking out stalls, when Walt came in with Peso behind him. Walt had the loose-shouldered walk of a man who was about to say something he'd been building up to for a while. "You've been wandering the pastures at night," Walt said. "I went for a walk. It was evening. Mercer doesn't pay us to take walks. He pays me to work the ranch. Walking the land is working the ranch." Walt leaned against the stall door. "Here's the thing. We've all been here a while. Hatch has been here 6 years. I've been here 4. We know this place. We don't need somebody coming in and doing whatever it is you're doing with that little notebook. I'm trying to understand the water problem." He blinked. "The water problem?" "The drought, the failing well, the cattle grazing pattern." She kept shoveling. "Something's wrong with the drainage on the east side of the property. I think there might be a subsurface water source that's being blocked." There was a silence. Peso looked at Walt. Walt looked at her with an expression that had moved from mild hostility into something more complicated. "You've been here 4 days," he said. 3.5. "And you figured out what we haven't figured out in 2 years. I don't know anything yet. I have a suspicion." She stopped shoveling and looked at him directly. "Do you want to hear it, or do you want to stand there looking bothered?" Peso made a sound that might have been a swallowed laugh. Walt straightened up off the stall door. "You're something else," he said. "I've been told." He left. Peso lingered a moment, and she caught something in his face. Curiosity, maybe, or the beginning of respect. He was young enough that those things still showed. "The East Ridge," he said quietly. "There used to be a creek there. My uncle told me from when he worked this land before Mercer bought it, 25 years ago. Creek ran along the base of that ridge for most of the year." She looked at him. "What happened to it?" Peso shrugged. "Dried up, people said. Same as everything." "But creeks don't just dry up," she said. "Not ones that ran that long. They get blocked or redirected. Something changes." She paused. "Did your uncle say when it stopped?" "I don't know. I'd have to ask him." He glanced toward the barn door. "He doesn't live too far." "I'd appreciate it if you would." He nodded once and went out. She went back to shoveling, but her mind was running elsewhere. Cole Mercer came to find her that evening. She was sitting on the water trough outside the main barn, eating a piece of bread left over from supper, reviewing her sketches in the last of the daylight. She heard him before she saw him, that slight irregularity in his footstep. He sat down on an overturned crate a few feet away and looked at the notebook she had open. "What is that?" he said. "My father's, and mine now, I suppose." She tilted it so he could see. "This is the east pasture. This line here is the ridge. The shading indicates where the grass pattern changes." He studied it, his brow pulled together. "You drew this?" "Yesterday. The grass is trying to follow water. The question is where that water's going, or where it's being stopped from going." He was quiet for a moment. Up close, she could see the fatigue in his face more clearly. Not just tiredness, but the particular exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a weight for a long time and had stopped being able to remember what it felt like not to carry it. The well consultant I brought in 8 months ago said the aquifer in this area is depleted, he said. Maybe, but aquifer depletion looks different than what I'm seeing. An aquifer goes dry gradually, evenly. The grass pattern on your east pasture isn't even. It's interrupted, like there's something redirecting the flow. He looked at her. You're not a hydrogeologist? No, I'm a woman who spent 18 years watching her father read land. And what he taught me is that before you accept that the water is gone, you should make sure nobody moved it. She hadn't planned to say it quite that way. She felt him go still. What do you mean by that? His voice had changed slightly. Not defensive, more like a man who has just heard something knock against an old wound. I mean that sometimes droughts are natural, and sometimes they're not. She closed the notebook. I may be wrong. Probably I'm missing something, but I'd like to dig along that ridge before I write off the east pasture. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The evening was cooling, the way Texas evenings did when the wind came off the plains, a relief that only lasted until you fell asleep and woke to the heat starting over again. What do you need? He said finally. 2 shovels, a longer measuring rod if you have one, and someone who doesn't mind getting dirty. I can get you that. And I'd like to talk to your records, deeds, property surveys, anything from before you bought the land. He looked at her with something she couldn't quite categorize. Dub told me you asked him about the water table on the drive in. He didn't know. No, he didn't. He paused. I don't either. Not really. He stood, picking up the crate and setting it aside. I'll pull the records tonight. You can look at them in the morning. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Cole, he said, if you're going to dig up my east pasture, we can probably drop the formalities. The records were in poor condition, which was its own kind of information. Cole had them spread on the kitchen table when she came in before dawn. A stack of papers, some in folders, some loose, covering what appeared to be multiple transactions and surveys going back 40 years. She sat down with a cup of coffee he'd already made and began to sort through them. He sat across from her, saying nothing, which she appreciated. Some men felt the need to narrate their own documents. The original land survey was dated 31 years ago, and it showed a watercourse along the East Ridge, a seasonal stream called Redley Creek, named, apparently, for the reddish sandstone it ran through. The survey noted that the creek was a tributary of a larger underground channel that fed several properties in the surrounding area. The second survey, done 12 years later when a different owner subdivided the land, showed the same creek. The third survey set, done 3 years before Cole had bought the property, did not mention the creek at all. She set the third survey down carefully. Who commissioned this one? Cole looked. I don't know. It predates me. It was part of the title paperwork when I bought. Do you recognize the name of the survey firm? He studied it. No, can't say I do. She turned to the property line documentation. The east boundary of Redstone Ranch was marked by a fence line. She found a hand-drawn property map from 15 years ago and laid it next to the current plat map. The fence lines didn't match, not by much, maybe 12, 15 feet, but the old east fence had run slightly closer to the ridge. The new one ran further back. She set both maps side by side and looked at them for a long moment. Cole, she said carefully, who owns the land on the other side of the east ridge? He leaned over to look. Fellow named Hargrove. Dallard Hargrove. He runs a land development company out of Lubbock. He doesn't ranch it. He's been trying to sell it off in parcels. When did he acquire it? Cole thought. 7, 8 years ago, I think. Bought out the Kelton family when they went under. They had bad years. And the Kelton family went under because drought. He paused. Same as every... He stopped. He looked at her. Same as me. She didn't say anything. She turned the old map and the new map so they faced him and put her finger on the fence line discrepancy. Before the fence was moved, she said, the boundary of your property ran closer to the base of the ridge. If Redley Creek still existed, it would have been on your side of that line. She moved her finger to the newer map. Now it's on his. Cole sat back. He was very quiet. I could be wrong about all of this, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm working from old surveys and a grass pattern in my father's notebooks. I haven't dug anything up yet. But you think someone blocked the creek? I think the creek didn't just stop. And I think the fence moved. And I think those two things might be related. She folded her hands around the coffee cup. I think before we accept that this ranch is dying from drought, we should find out whether somebody helped it along. Cole looked at the maps for a long time. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of wind under the eaves, and somewhere outside, one of the cattle making that low, exhausted sound they made in the early morning. "All right," he said. His voice was level, but she could hear something underneath it. Anger, maybe, or the shape where anger would be once he allowed himself to have it. "We dig along the ridge." They went out the next morning at first light. Cole, Clara, and Peso, who had come back the evening before with word from his uncle that, yes, Redley Creek had run until about 9 years ago and had gone dry more or less overnight, or at least that was how his uncle remembered it. One season it was there and the next it wasn't, and everyone had chalked it up to the drought that had been coming and going across the region. Overnight, Clara thought, walking the base of the ridge with a measuring rod. Aquifers didn't go dry overnight. Creeks that ran through sandstone didn't vanish in a single season. Not without help. The ridge itself was about 30 feet from the current fence line, which put it squarely on redstone land. She worked her way along the base, probing the soil at intervals, looking for the soft spots that indicated subsurface moisture. Peso walked behind her, carrying the shovels. Cole walked ahead, checking the fence line, saying little. She found the first soft spot about 200 yards south of where she'd seen the green grass line 3 nights before. She drove the measuring rod down and felt it change at about 14 inches, from the dry, compacted soil above to something looser and damper below. "Here," she said. Peso came up with the shovels. She took one, drove it into the ground, and started to dig. Cole came back and took the other shovel without being asked. They dug for about an hour. The soil got progressively damper. At about 2.5 feet, she hit something hard that wasn't rock. She cleared the dirt away carefully with her hands. It was wood. Old, weathered, but still solid. A timber, roughly squared, set horizontally in the ground. "What in the hell?" Cole said quietly. She kept clearing. There was more than one timber. They were set in a frame, with gaps filled by packed clay that had dried as hard as adobe. It was a deliberate construction, not elaborate, but effective. Something built to redirect, or block, the flow of water through this section of the drainage channel. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. "This didn't happen naturally," she said. Cole crouched beside her, studying the timbers. She could see his jaw working. He reached in and pressed his hand against the clay packing between 2 of the beams. It crumbled slightly at the edges. "How old do you think this is?" he said. "Hard to say. 8, 10 years. The wood's old, but it's been underground. Could be less." She looked at the construction. It wasn't built by someone who didn't know what they were doing. Whoever did this understood where the water ran. Peso had gone quiet. He was standing above them on the edge of the excavation, looking at the timbers with an expression that was somewhere between amazed and afraid. "What does this mean?" he said. Clara looked up at him. "It means the water is still here. It's been here the whole time. It's just been going somewhere it shouldn't." She turned to Cole. He was still crouching beside the blockage, and she watched him put the pieces together behind his eyes. The failing well, the bad survey, the fence that had moved, the neighbor who had been buying up ranches that failed, and now this. A barrier, built by someone who knew the land, designed to starve the water from this side of the ridge and send it where it would do someone else more good. "Hargrove," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's one possibility." He looked at her. "You think there are others?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think Dallard Hargrove didn't dig this himself. Someone who knew hydrology did this. Someone who knew exactly where to put this so that the effect would look natural, so that a water consultant would look at your well and say, 'The aquifer's depleted,' and believe it." She paused. "This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was planned." Cole stood up. He was a little pale under his tan, which was the closest she'd seen him come to showing how bad this was hitting him. "How much water do you think is down there?" he said. "Enough." She looked at the barrier again. "If we remove this and anything else like it, I think Redley Creek comes back. Or something like it. I think the East pasture starts recovering within weeks. She looked at him. I think this ranch isn't dying from drought, Cole. I think it's being killed. The wind moved through the dry grass around them. Somewhere above on the ridge, a hawk was circling, and they all stood there for a moment not saying anything, looking at the evidence of something deliberate buried in the ground beneath their feet. Then Cole Mercer straightened his shoulders. She saw him do it, the small physical act of deciding something, and said, "We need to document all of this before we touch it." "Yes?" "And I need to get someone out here who can look at this with legal eyes." "Yes. Before that—" She hesitated. "Before you call anyone, I want to walk the rest of the ridge. This might not be the only one." He looked at her for a long moment. The sun was coming up over the hill in the east, cutting hard and sideways, and in that light he looked tired and something else she didn't have an easy word for. Not grateful, exactly. More like a man who had just learned that something he thought was fate was actually a choice someone else had made, and was in the process of deciding how that changed things. "Then we walked the ridge," he said. "Mutt." They found 2 more barriers that day. The second was smaller, about 400 yards north, a simpler construction, more clay than timber, that had collapsed partially on itself over time and was still doing damage but less efficiently than the first. The third was the most deliberate of the 3, a full timber frame with stone packing along the joints, built at a point where the underground channel narrowed and where blocking it would have the most upstream effect. By the time they'd cataloged all 3, Clara sketching them, Peso digging where she directed, Cole taking his own notes in a field ledger he'd gone back to the house for. It was past midday and they were all dirty and quiet. Hatch had brought lunch out in a pail, and the 4 of them sat in the sparse shade of the ridge while they ate. Hatch had been told enough to understand what they'd found, and he sat with his lunch untouched in his lap, looking at the exposed first barrier. 9 years, he said finally. 9 years we've been watching this place dry up. And someone put this here? Looks like it, Cole said. Hatch was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I'm going to need you to tell me that the man who did this is going to face some kind of consequence, because I've been cutting my wage for 3 years to stay on here when I could have left. I stayed because... He stopped. Tell me there's going to be a consequence. There's going to be a consequence, Cole said. He said it quietly and without drama, which was somehow more convincing than if he'd raised his voice. Clara looked at the excavated barrier, at the old timbers that had been sitting there for nearly a decade, diverting water away from the land and the cattle, and the man who'd bought this ranch in good faith and hadn't known what was being done to him. She thought about the thin cattle in the corral, the dry creek bed, the well that came up brown. She thought about the Kelton family, whoever they were, who had sold their land to Dallard Hargrove when it failed. She thought about how many other ranches might have fences that moved by 12 feet and surveys that forgot to mention a creek. There's going to be a consequence, she said, mostly to herself. Peso looked at her. You already know what you want to do next, don't you? He said. It was not quite a question. She looked at him, this 19-year-old kid with a scar on his jaw and better instincts than he knew what to do with. I want to remove these barriers, she said, but before we do that, I want to know who surveyed this land for the last time before Cole bought it. I want to know what the property records on Hargrove's side of the ridge show, and I want to know how many other ranches in this county have had water problems in the last decade. She paused. Because if this is what I think it is, this isn't just about Redstone Ranch. Cole set his lunch down. He looked at her the same way he'd looked at her across the maps that morning, that careful, recalibrating look. You came here for a ranch hand job, he said. I needed work. And now you're talking about investigating a land fraud scheme across multiple properties. I'm talking about finding out what happened to your water and why. She met his eyes. You can tell me to stop. I'll go back to mucking stalls. He looked at her for a long moment, then out at the ridge, then back. No, he said. You found this. You keep going. She nodded once. Walt had come out at some point during lunch, drawn by curiosity or by Hatch's lack of return, and he was standing a little apart from the group, looking at the excavated barrier with an expression she couldn't read. After a while, he walked over and crouched down beside it, looking at the timber construction the way you looked at something you were trying to understand. I owe you an apology, he said without looking at her. For what? For what I said in the barn. He stood up, still not looking at her. I didn't think you knew what you were doing. You didn't know me. No. He finally looked at her. I'm looking at 3 structures buried in this man's land that have been stealing his water for 10 years, and I'm thinking about how we all walked over this ground, all of us, for years, and never saw it. He paused. You were here 4 days. She didn't say anything. How'd you see it? He said. She thought about her father, sitting on the porch of their little place in the hill country, watching the grass the way other men watched the sky. Someone taught me to look, she said. That night, after supper, after Cole had gone into his office with the maps and his ledger and what passed for thinking time, Clara sat outside on the step of the bunkhouse with one of her father's notebooks open on her knee. She wasn't reading it. She was just holding it, the way you held things that connected you to people you'd lost. The sky over Texas was immense and thick with stars. The cattle were quiet. The night bugs were doing their work. Somewhere in the darkness, the water she'd found today was still moving through the earth the way it had always moved, patient and indifferent, running toward where it was supposed to go, blocked by something that had no right to be there. The ground is talking, her father had said. You just have to know the language. She closed the notebook. She thought about Dallard Hargrove, whoever he was, sitting in an office in Lubbock. She thought about the survey firm whose name Cole didn't recognize. She thought about the fence that had moved 12 feet and the creek that had gone dry overnight. She thought about what her father would have done. He would have gotten up the next morning and kept looking, that was all. You kept looking until you found it, and when you found it, you held on to it with both hands. She looked up at the sky. She was not going anywhere. The survey firm was called Callaway and Associates, and it did not exist. Cole found that out on the 3rd day after their discovery, when he rode into Harlow and sent a telegraph to the county records office in Lubbock asking for verification of the firm's licensing. The reply came back the following afternoon. No firm by that name had ever held a surveying license in the state of Texas. He came back to the ranch and told Clara. She was in the east pasture, on her knees beside the second excavation they'd opened, measuring the timber frame with a piece of knotted cord. She listened without stopping what she was doing. So the last survey done on this property, before you bought it, she said, was conducted by a company that doesn't legally exist. That's what they're telling me. And the title company that processed your purchase, do you still have their paperwork? I have everything. She sat back on her heels. The morning was already brutal, the sun pressing down flat and relentless, and she could feel the sweat moving along her collar. Then somebody put a false survey into a legitimate title process. That's not one person acting alone. That takes connections. Someone inside the title company or someone who knew how to move paper through it without anyone looking too closely. Cole crouched beside her, looking at the exposed timber. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation yet. It's an observation. She looked at him. Do you know anyone at the title company? I know of them. I don't know them personally. Who recommended them to you when you bought the ranch? He was quiet for a moment. The seller's agent. And who was the seller? He met her eyes. A holding company. He paused. I never met anyone in person. All the paperwork came through the agent. Clara turned back to the timber frame and said nothing for a while. The shape of the thing was becoming clear. Not all at once, but the way a figure emerged from fog, detail by detail. Someone had created a chain of transactions that put distance between themselves and what was being done to Redstone Ranch. The false survey. The holding company. The title agent in the middle. Layers of paper between Dallard Hargrove and the barriers buried in Cole Mercer's ground. Cole, she said carefully. How much is this land worth? Redstone Ranch. What would it sell for in your best estimate if it were healthy? He thought about it. This much acreage with water rights intact, good grazing, probably $40,000, $50,000. Maybe more depending on who was buying. And what's it worth now, as it stands? He said nothing. Less than your debt, she said. Not cruelly, just plainly. Yes. And if you defaulted, if the bank called your note, who would be positioned to buy it? He stood up slowly. Someone who already owned the land on the other side of the ridge, he said. Someone who'd been acquiring distressed properties in the county. Someone whose land would double in value the moment the water rights on this side were legally consolidated with his. She stood too, brushing the red dirt off her knees. That's the whole thing, Cole. That's what this is. The barriers aren't just about stealing your water. They're about starving this ranch until you can't hold it anymore, and then buying it for almost nothing. And then, once it's all one property, the water comes back on its own because there's nothing left to block it from. The hawk was back on the ridge, or one like it. Cole watched it for a moment without seeming to see it. "How long have you been thinking this?" he said. "Since the first morning I looked at your maps." He turned to look at her. Something in his expression had tightened. Not at her, she could tell that, but at the situation, at the scope of it settling fully into place. "Why didn't you say so sooner?" "Because suspicion isn't evidence. I needed the timbers." She picked up her cord and her notebook. "I still need more." Boss. Peso came back from his uncle's place 2 days later with a name she hadn't expected. He found her in the barn, and he had the look of someone who'd been carrying information for a while and was relieved to put it down. "My uncle knows the man who built those barriers," he said. She stopped what she was doing. "He knows him personally?" "Knew him. Man's dead now. He was a water engineer, worked for a company out of Lubbock about 10 years ago. My uncle did some hauling work for the same outfit one summer. That's how he met the man. Name was Fitch. He did subsurface drainage work, redirecting water channels, that kind of thing." Peso sat down on a hay bale. "My uncle said Fitch was good at what he did. Said he could look at a piece of ground and tell you exactly where the water was and exactly how to move it. Does your uncle know who hired Fitch to do this work?" "He doesn't know for certain, but he said the company Fitch worked for at the time had Hargrove as a client. Said everyone in that line of work knew it because Hargrove was buying land all through the county, and he paid well and he didn't ask questions." "Did your uncle tell anyone this at the time?" Peso looked at the ground. "He didn't know what was being done with it. Fitch didn't tell him the specifics. He just knew Fitch did drainage work for Hargrove's properties." He paused. "He feels bad about it now." "He didn't do anything wrong." "No, but he knew the man, and the man did wrong, and—" Peso shrugged. "He just feels bad." She understood that. Some guilts weren't about fault. They were about proximity. "Would your uncle be willing to put what he knows in writing?" she said. Peso looked up. "For what purpose?" "Because we're going to need to give a federal marshal something worth acting on. Right now we have buried timbers and a fraudulent survey and a dead water engineer whose former employer had ties to Hargrove. That's a beginning. Written testimony from someone who can connect those pieces makes it harder to dismiss." Peso was quiet for a moment. "You really think this goes to a federal marshal?" "It crosses county lines," she said, "possibly state lines if Hargrove's been doing this elsewhere. The moment you involve fraudulent title documentation and deliberate destruction of water rights across multiple properties, you're in federal territory." She looked at him directly. "This is bigger than one ranch, Peso. I think we both know that." He nodded slowly. "I'll talk to him." She found the fourth barrier on her own, on a Thursday morning when the rest of the men were moving cattle to the north pasture. This one was different from the others, older, constructed from stone rather than timber, set deeper in the ground at a point where the underground channel ran beneath a natural shelf of rock. Whoever had built it had used the rock formation itself as part of the structure, which was either ingenious or deeply familiar with this specific piece of land, or both. She measured it, sketched it, and sat back in the dirt and thought about the person who had planned all of this. You had to know the land intimately to do what had been done here. You couldn't hire someone to just come in and block a water source you'd never seen. Someone had walked this ridge. Someone had mapped the underground drainage the way her father had mapped the hill country operations, with patience and knowledge and a specific understanding of how water moved through this particular geology. The engineering, she thought, was almost beautiful, if it hadn't been designed to ruin people. She was still sitting there, notebook open, when she heard boots on the ridge above her and looked up to find Cole picking his way down the rocky face. "Thought I might find you here," he said. "Found another one." He looked at the stone construction. He had a letter in his hand. She could see the edge of it. "Mail came," he said. "It's from the bank." She didn't ask. She waited. "They're accelerating the note." The full amount outstanding, due in 60 days. He sat down on the rock shelf above her excavation. They say it's based on the assessed decline in property value, standard procedure in cases of extended drought-related loss. He said the last part with a specific flatness that told her what he thought of the word standard. 60 days, she said. 60 days. She looked at the stone barrier. She thought about the timing, because the timing was not coincidental. Someone knew they'd started digging, word traveled. In a county this size, with a banking institution that had its own interests in who owned what, 60 days could be the end of Redstone Ranch as cleanly as any drought. The bank, she said. Who holds your note? First Commercial of Lubbock. She wrote that down in the margin of her sketch. Does Hargrove have any relationship with First Commercial of Lubbock that you know of? Cole looked at her with the expression of a man watching a door swing open onto a room he hadn't known was there. I don't know. We need to find out. She stood up and dusted her hands on her trousers. The dirt here was reddish gray, and she had it on her coat, her boots, her hands. She probably had it on her face. She didn't particularly care. Cole, whoever is doing this knows we've started finding things. The bank letter is not a coincidence. 60 days is designed to put you under before you can document enough to fight back. He was quiet. You're not wrong, he said. I've been thinking the same thing since I opened it. Then we work faster. She picked up her notebook. I want to get a man out here who can officially certify what these barriers are and where they are and what their effect has been. Someone the federal courts will recognize as an expert. If we're going to make this case, we need documentation that doesn't come just from me. Where do I find someone like that? There's a hydraulic engineer at the land-grant college in Abilene. His name is Adler. My father consulted with him once, a long time ago. He's legitimate, he's respected, and if I write to him today, he might be willing to come out within the week. She paused. It'll cost you. I know. And you're already short. I know that too. He stood up. Write the letter. The evening before Adler was due to arrive, Clara was sitting at the table in the main house going through Cole's financial records, at his request, though she suspected it had cost him something to make it, when the sound of horses in the yard brought her to the window. Two men she didn't recognize had ridden in and were talking to Dub near the gate. She watched Dub shake his head twice and point back toward the road. The men didn't leave immediately. They sat on their horses for a moment longer than was natural for men who'd been told to go, and then they went. She went out. Who were they? She asked Dub. Said they were looking for water access, claimed their cattle had strayed this direction. He squinted after the departed riders. Didn't look like cowboys to me. What did they look like? He thought about it. Men who get paid to go places and ask questions. He paused. Or to go places and not ask questions. She understood the distinction. She went and found Cole and told him. He listened, jaw tight. Hargrove's people, he said. Or the people Hargrove pays. Possibly. She looked out toward the east ridge in the failing light. We haven't removed the barriers yet. If they're coming to check on whether we found them. Then someone told them we'd been digging. Yes. They looked at each other. There's a problem with that, Cole said slowly. The only people who knew about the excavations are the men on this ranch. She had thought of that already. She'd been turning it over since the bank letter arrived. Not with suspicion. She didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't quite put it down either. 6 men on this property, one of them possibly passing word to someone outside it. I don't think it's Peso, she said. No? He didn't hesitate on that, which she noted. Hatch has been with me 6 years and I'd stake a lot on him. Walt and Birch. He stopped. Birch took a week off 2 months back, said he was going to see his sister in Midland. Did he seem different when he came back? Cole thought about it. He was quieter. I figured he'd had trouble with the sister. He ran a hand along the back of his neck. I don't want to believe it. Neither do I, but we should be careful what we say within earshot of the bunkhouse. She paused. And we should move faster. Adler arrived the following afternoon in a hired buggy, a compact man in his 50s with spectacles and a leather satchel that clinked when he set it down. He looked at the landscape around Redstone Ranch with the particular attention of a man reading text he was trained for and she liked him immediately. She walked him to the East Ridge herself. Cole came, and Peso came, and nobody else. She showed him all 4 barriers in sequence, explained her methodology, showed him her sketches and her notes alongside her father's notebooks. He was quiet for a long time at each site. At the 3rd barrier, the most sophisticated construction, he crouched and spent nearly 15 minutes examining the stone packing and the angle of placement before he said anything. "This is deliberate," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said, "and deliberate with knowledge." He looked up at her. Whoever engineered this understood the pressure dynamics of this channel. This placement here, he indicated the angle of the main stone face. This would maximize upstream backup while appearing, to a casual observer, like natural sediment accumulation. He stood up. "This is not the work of a farmer who got lucky. This is the work of someone trained in hydraulic engineering. We believe we know who. He's deceased." Adler looked at her steadily. "And who commissioned the work?" "We're building that case." He nodded slowly. He was quiet again, looking at the barrier. "Miss Boone, if you remove these structures correctly, in sequence, starting from the northernmost, I would estimate water flow to this drainage channel could be restored within 2 to 3 weeks. Possibly sooner, depending on current subsurface saturation." He looked at the dry ground around them. "The land hasn't lost its capacity. It's been prevented from expressing it." Something tightened in her chest. She hadn't let herself feel the full weight of that, the waste of it, the deliberate, profitable waste, until she heard someone else say it plainly. "Can you certify that in writing?" she said, "with enough technical specificity to support a legal claim?" "I can have a full report to you within 10 days. He picked up his satchel. "I'll need to document each site photographically and take soil samples." He looked at her with something close to respect. "You found all 4 of these yourself?" "I had my father's notebooks." He glanced at the worn cover of the one she was holding. "Your father was in this work?" "He was a rancher who paid attention." Adler smiled, a small, dry smile. "Those are the best teachers," he said, and walked on toward the next site. That night it rained. Not much, barely enough to settle the dust in the yard. But it rained, and Clara stood outside the bunkhouse in it for a few minutes, face up, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing there. She heard the door open behind her and knew from the footstep it was Cole. He stood beside her, and they both looked out at the dark yard and the dark ridge beyond it, and the thin rain coming down. "Adler's report, plus your testimony, plus Peso's uncle," he said. "Is that enough?" "It's a start. The fraudulent survey is probably the strongest piece legally. The physical barriers support it. If we can connect Hargrove's financial relationship with the bank, that's the hard part." "That's always the hard part," she said. "The people who do things like this are careful. The dirt is always 3 layers down." He was quiet for a moment. "You sound like you've seen this before." "Not this exactly, but my father lost land once, when I was young, a dispute with a neighboring family who had a lawyer and he didn't. He always said, afterward, when he was calmer, that the difference between winning and losing wasn't who was right. It was who could hold on long enough to prove it." Cole didn't say anything for a while. The rain was already thinning. "What happened to your father's land?" he said. "He didn't get it back." She said it without self-pity. "He moved on, built something else." She paused, but he never stopped being angry about it. He just learned to make the anger useful. Somewhere in the darkness across the yard, one of the cattle made a low, tired sound. 60 days, Cole said. 60 days, she said. Then we'd better not waste them. They removed the first barrier on a Monday. It took most of the morning, Cole and Peso and Walt working with iron bars and shovels, while Clara directed the sequence, crouched at the edge of the excavation with her notebook, calling out where to pull and where to brace. Adler had left detailed instructions before returning to Abilene, and she followed them carefully. The timber frame had to come out in a specific order to avoid collapsing the channel walls. One wrong pull and they damaged the very thing they were trying to restore. Dub watched from a distance. Birch had been given other work that morning, fence repair on the far west side of the property, far enough away that he wouldn't see what they were doing. Clara had suggested this to Cole quietly the night before, and he'd agreed without debate, which told her he'd been thinking the same thing. When the last timber came free, nothing happened immediately. That was the first thing. No dramatic surge of water, no sudden transformation, just a hole in the ground and a pile of old wood, and 4 people standing around breathing hard in the heat. "Is that it?" Walt said. "That's the first one," Clara said. "We do the other 3 the same way, in order, north to south. And then water just comes back?" "Not today. Maybe not for a week. The channel has to redistribute." She looked at the exposed earth at the bottom of the excavation, darker than the soil around it, faintly damp. "But it's moving again. It's been moving since we broke the seal." Walt looked at the damp earth for a moment. "Huh," he said, and picked up his shovel. They spent the rest of the week on the remaining 3 barriers. The 4th, the oldest, the stone one, took 2 full days because the construction had partially merged with the surrounding rock formation over the years, and pulling it apart wrong could have sealed the channel permanently. Clara worked that one mostly herself, hands in the earth, Adler's notes beside her, every choice deliberate. Cole didn't rush her. He brought water out to her in the afternoon and set it down without comment and went back to other work, which was exactly what she needed. By Saturday, all 4 barriers were out and documented. Photographs taken by Adler before he left, sketches in Clara's notebook, written measurements, soil samples in labeled jars sitting in a box under Cole's bed where they'd be hardest to reach without waking him. Sunday morning, Clara walked to the creek bed at first light. The ground at the base of the east ridge was damp. Not wet, not yet, but definitively, unmistakably damp, in a 6-inch line running along the base of the rock face, at the point where Redley Creek had once run. She crouched and pressed her palm to it and felt the coolness against her skin and sat there for a moment with her hand in the earth and didn't say anything to anyone because there was nobody else there yet and she wanted to feel it by herself first. Her father would have known what to say. She didn't. She just stayed there until the sun got too bright, and then she stood up and walked back. The letter arrived on Tuesday. It was addressed to Cole, postmarked Lubbock, no return name. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 8 words printed in block letters. "Stop what you are doing. Last warning." Cole read it, folded it, and handed it to Clara without a word. She read it and folded it again along his crease. "Have you received anything like this before?" "No?" "Then we've gotten close enough to worry someone." She set the letter on the table. "This goes in the box with the soil samples." He looked at her. "You're not concerned?" "I'm concerned, but I'm more concerned about the 60-day clock." She sat down at the table. "They're trying to make you hesitate. If you stop now, they win without having to do anything else. If you keep going, they have to escalate. And escalation creates evidence." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's a cold way to look at a threat." "I'm not saying it isn't a real threat. I'm saying the answer to it is to move faster, not slower." She paused. "Do you have a gun in this house?" 3. "Keep one closer than usual." He nodded, just once, and that was the end of that conversation. It was Hatch who first noticed the cattle. He came to the main house before dawn on Thursday, knocked once, and when Cole opened the door, Hatch's face had the look of a man delivering news he hadn't wanted to carry. 6 head, he said, in the South Corral. They were fine last night. Clara was already dressed. She'd slept poorly, and she came up behind Cole in the doorway. "Sick or dead?" "Sick, bad sick." Hatch looked at her. "The way they're acting, the shaking, the way they're holding their heads, I've seen it before once. When I was younger, a water source on a place I worked had been contaminated with something chemical. Cattle looked just like this." She was already moving past both of them toward the corral. The 6 cattle were standing in a cluster in the far corner, and Hatch's description had been accurate. The trembling, the lowered heads, the refusal to move, it matched what she'd seen described in her father's notes from a contamination case in Kimball County. She looked at the water trough in the South Corral. It was full, clear-looking, no visible sign of anything wrong. She found a tin cup hanging on the corral post and dipped it in and held it to the light. Still clear. She brought it to her nose. There, faint, but there, a smell that didn't belong. chemical, slightly sweet. This trough gets its water from where? She said. Shared line from the main cistern, Hatch said, but the South Corral has its own intake valve. Who has access to that valve? Nobody answered immediately. The answer was, anyone on the property. She set the cup down carefully. Don't let any more cattle drink from this trough. Move them to the North Corral. Use the hand pump water only. She turned to Cole. Send for the veterinarian in Harlow. I need him to take a sample from this trough and tell me in writing what's in it. Cole had gone very still. They poisoned my water. Someone did. She looked at him steadily. That's criminal damage. That's evidence. She paused. And it tells us something. What? Whoever did this came onto this property. Last night, after dark, without being seen. They knew which trough to target. The one that fed the South Corral where we've been rotating the weakest cattle. She looked around the yard, the bunkhouse, the barn, the gate. Either they knew the layout of this ranch very well, or someone told them. Cole's eyes moved to the bunkhouse. Don't say anything to anyone yet, she said quietly. Not until the vet comes and documents this. The vet came that afternoon. A tired, competent man named Greer, who asked few questions and did thorough work. He took samples from the trough, examined the cattle, wrote everything down in a ledger he carried, and told them the cattle would probably recover if they were kept off the contaminated water and given supportive care. He named what he suspected was in the trough, a compound used in industrial cleaning, available from suppliers in Lubbock and Abilene. How much would you need to obtain a quantity of this? Clara asked. Not much. It's not tightly regulated. Greer closed his ledger. But you'd need to know the dosage. Too little, and the cattle just get sick. Too much, and they die immediately, and you've got a different kind of problem. He looked at her. Whoever did this knew the right amount. That's not a coincidence. After he left, Clara sat with Cole at the kitchen table. The afternoon was hot, and the house held the heat badly, and they were both tired in the specific way that came from not sleeping enough over too many consecutive nights. Birch left last night, Cole said. She looked at him. I checked this morning. His gear's gone. He didn't say anything to anyone. Cole folded his hands on the table. He looked like a man who had been hit somewhere that hadn't bruised yet. He was here 7 years. 7. I'm sorry, she said. Money, you think? Or fear, or both. She paused. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that someone on the outside knew our timeline, knew our layout, and had the knowledge to poison a water supply without killing the cattle outright. She straightened. That's their signature. The same signature as the barriers. Precise, calculated, designed to cause damage that looks like bad luck. It's not bad luck. No, it's not. She met his eyes. Cole, we need to contact a federal marshal. Not eventually. Now. The poisoned water, the threatening letter, the false survey, that's enough to open an investigation. And once an investigation is opened, they lose the ability to operate quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. If I go to a federal marshal and it comes to nothing, I know. If it spooks Hargrove and he moves the money and covers the trail, I know. If the bank hears I'm making accusations against people and they call the note early, Cole, she said it quietly. I know. All of those things could happen. She paused. But you have 42 days left on your note, cattle that are poisoned, a confirmed fraudulent survey, 4 illegally constructed water barriers, a bank that may be connected to the man trying to take your land, and a man who just ran in the night after 7 years. She held his gaze. Doing nothing is also a choice. It just looks like patience. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, she could hear Walt moving the sick cattle to the North Corral, speaking to them in the low, meaningless patter that men sometimes used with animals when they were scared for them. I have a contact, Cole said finally. Man I served with briefly years ago. He went into federal law enforcement. I don't know if he's still there or if he'd take a meeting, but write to him tonight, Clara said. Tonight, Cole, not tomorrow. He wrote the letter that night. She sat across the table while he wrote it, reviewing Adler's notes, organizing the documentation they had into a logical sequence. The original survey, the fraudulent one, the property map discrepancies, the barrier measurements, Adler's certification, the threatening letter, the vet's report. When he finished writing, he read what he'd written and handed it to her. She read it and handed it back. "Add one thing," she said. "Tell him the bank accelerated the note after we started finding evidence. Tell him the timing." Cole added it. Then he sealed the letter, and they both looked at it sitting on the table. "If I'm wrong about any of this," he said, "you're not wrong. You can't know that for certain." "No," she said, "but I know what we found in that ground. And I know who benefits from this ranch going under, and I know that water doesn't stop running on its own." She looked at him. "I'm not wrong." The next 3 days had a particular quality of tension that she recognized. The feeling of waiting for something you knew was coming but couldn't see the shape of yet. The cattle in the North Corral slowly improved. The ground along the East Ridge got visibly damper, the damp line extending, and, in 2 places, beginning to pool in the low points where rock created a natural basin. Not a creek yet. The suggestion of one. She kept working. She organized, she documented, she helped with the remaining ranch work, the feeding, the fence repair, the daily tasks that had to happen regardless of what else was happening. She didn't sleep much, but she'd never needed a lot of sleep. It was Walt who brought her information she hadn't expected. He found her on the ridge on a Wednesday evening and sat down beside her with the uncomfortable posture of a man about to admit something. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right." "About 2 months before you came, a man came to the ranch looking for Cole. Cole was in Harlow. The man talked to Dub and me. He picked up a piece of sandstone and turned it in his hands. Said he was from an investment company. Said he was interested in buying the ranch and he wanted to know what shape it was in, what the water situation was, whether Cole was thinking about selling." "What did you tell him?" "We told him the truth. The water was bad. The cattle were struggling. Cole wasn't talking about selling, but the way things were going..." He stopped. "We didn't think anything of it. Men come around with offers sometimes. It's not unusual." She waited. "But he asked specific questions," Walt said. "He asked about the South Corral specifically. He asked about the intake valves. He said he was doing a property assessment." Walt set the stone down. "I didn't think anything of it then. Now I think I was talking to whoever came back and poisoned that trough." She was quiet for a moment. "What did he look like?" Walt described a man. Medium height, dressed too well for the work, hands without callus. She wrote it down. "Did he give a name?" "Said his name was Carver. I don't know if that's real." She wrote that down too. "You didn't tell Cole about this visit." Walt looked at the ground. "We forgot about it. Honestly, men come and go. It didn't seem important until..." He stopped again. "I should have told him." "Yes," she said. Not harshly, just honestly. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Is this bad? For Cole?" She thought about how to answer that. "It's bad," she said, "but we know more than we did. Every piece of what they did is a piece of evidence they left behind, and the more they do, the more they leave." She paused. "Tell Cole about the visit. Tonight. All of it, exactly as you told me." Walt nodded. He looked relieved to have put it down, the way Peso had looked when he'd brought her his uncle's information. She was becoming, she realized, the person people brought things to. She wasn't sure when that had happened. Cole's contact replied 10 days later. His name was Marshall Everett Slade, and he was assigned to the federal district office in Fort Worth, and he was coming to Redstone Ranch the following Thursday with a colleague. Cole read the reply aloud at supper, which was the first time the full group, minus Birch, minus nobody else now, had been together in several days. Hatch absorbed it with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Peso looked at Clara. Walt looked at the table. "He says to preserve everything," Cole said, looking at Clara. "It's preserved." "He says not to confront Hargrove or any of his associates directly." "I wasn't planning to." Cole folded the letter. He looked around the table at the men who had stayed. Dub, who hadn't said much in weeks but had done everything asked of him without complaint. Hatch, who'd been here the longest. Peso, who'd brought his uncle's testimony and earned every bit of trust she'd placed in him. Walt, who'd made his errors and was making up for them the only way available to him, which was to keep working. "I want to say something," Cole said. He seemed slightly uncomfortable saying it, which made it land better than it would have if he'd been smooth about it. "What's been done to this ranch? I've been living with the weight of it for 2 years without knowing what it was, thinking it was my fault, thinking I'd bought land I couldn't manage or made decisions I shouldn't have." He paused. "Finding out it wasn't that..." He stopped. "It matters. I just want you all to know it matters." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Hatch said, "Don't go soft on us, Mercer. We've got work to do." There was a brief, rough silence, and then Cole almost smiled and the table eased. Clara looked at her plate. She thought about Birch, who had sold them out and run. She thought about the man named Carver, who had come to assess a property he was helping destroy. She thought about Dallard Hargrove in his Lubbock office, calculating timelines and bank relationships and the price of distressed land. She thought about Thursday. Outside, the night had cooled, and through the window above the table she could see the ridge in the moonlight, dark and still. Somewhere beneath it, water was moving again, slowly, finding its way back through channels that had been blocked for years, working toward the surface with the patience of something that had never been gone, only redirected. The ground was talking. She was still listening. Marshall Everett Slade was not what she'd expected. She had built a picture of him from Cole's sparse description: federal man, former military, serious, and had imagined someone large and formal with a badge worn prominently. The man who rode in Thursday Morning was slight, somewhere past 50, with a gray mustache and the kind of eyes that moved constantly without seeming to. He wore a plain coat and a hat with a dented crown, and he shook Cole's hand and then turned to Clara and said, "You're the one who found the barriers." "Yes." "Good," he said, and that was apparently all the introduction he needed. His colleague was a younger man named Taft, broad through the shoulders, who carried a camera and a case of equipment and said almost nothing for the entire first day except to ask technical questions in a quiet voice. Clara spent that day walking them through everything: the ridge, the excavation sites, the documentation she'd assembled, the box under Cole's bed with the soil samples and the threatening letter, and the vet's report. Slade asked questions that were pointed and specific, and occasionally, she thought, designed to catch her in an inconsistency. She answered everything directly, and when she didn't know something, she said so. At the fourth excavation site, the old stone barrier, Slade crouched and looked at the construction for a long time without speaking. Taft photographed it from multiple angles. "Who identified this as deliberate obstruction?" Slade said. "You or the engineer?" "I identified it first. Dr. Adler certified it independently." "Without knowing your prior assessment?" "I showed him my sketches. He knew my general hypothesis." Slade looked at her. "That could be a problem. Defense will argue his assessment was influenced by yours." His report documents each barrier individually with independent measurement and analysis. He reached his conclusions from the physical evidence, not from my opinion. She paused. "I also have his written statement saying he would have reached the same conclusions without seeing my notes first." Slade looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You anticipated that." "I've been thinking about what we'd need to make this hold up." He stood. "All right," he said, and moved on. That evening, Slade and Taft sat at Cole's kitchen table with the full documentation spread before them, and what followed was 2 hours that felt to Clara like a very slow dissection. Slade went through every document, asked questions about provenance and chain of custody, and how each piece of evidence had been stored and handled. He was not unfriendly, but he was thorough in a way that assumed nothing and trusted no one entirely, which she respected. At the end of it, he sat back and looked at Cole. "You understand what you're alleging," he said. "I understand what the evidence shows," Cole said. "What it potentially shows. Right now we have illegal construction on your property, a fraudulent survey document, and a circumstantial connection to Dallard Hargrove." Slade folded his hands. "Hargrove is not a small target. He has lawyers. He has political relationships in this state. If we move on this and the case isn't airtight, he walks, you lose the ranch anyway, and nobody touches him again for 20 years. The room was quiet. "What do you need to make it airtight?" Clara said. Slade looked at her. Financial documentation connecting Hargrove to the survey fraud. Direct evidence linking him or his agents to the construction of those barriers. And ideally, he paused, evidence that this pattern extends beyond Redstone Ranch. One fraudulent survey is a local crime. A systematic scheme across multiple properties is a federal one. The Kelton family, Clara said. They owned the land on the east side of the ridge before Hargrove. They failed and sold. Before them, do you know who owned it? Slade glanced at Taft, who opened a folder. According to county records, 3 properties in this section of Harlow County have changed hands in distress sales over the past 12 years. Kelton was the most recent. Before that, the Alderman family, Drought and Debt, sold to a holding company. Before that, Prescott Ranch. Fire destroyed feed stores. Insurers disputed the claim. They defaulted. Clara was writing. What holding company acquired the Alderman property? Taft checked. Sunset Land Partners. Is Sunset Land Partners connected to Hargrove? That, Slade said, is what I've been trying to establish for the past 6 months on an unrelated matter. He looked at her steadily. You're not the first person to notice Hargrove's acquisition pattern. You're the first person to dig up his methodology. She looked at him. You already knew. I suspected. I didn't have the physical evidence to open a formal investigation. He nodded toward the documentation on the table. This gives me that. He paused. But I need more than this ranch to build the full case. I need to get onto the Alderman and Kelton properties and look for the same construction. The Alderman property? Hargrove owns it now? Through Sunset Land Partners, yes. So you'd need a warrant. I'd need cause for a warrant. Your evidence gives me that cause for this property. Extending it to the others requires me to show a pattern. He looked at her. Which is why I'm going to need you to be a formal witness, Miss Boone. Sworn testimony, documented account of your findings, available for deposition. I'll do whatever's needed. Cole said, what about the bank? The accelerated note? Slade's expression shifted slightly. Something measured there, like a man considering how much to put on the table. First Commercial of Lubbock has appeared in 2 of the previous distress sales in this county. Both times they held the mortgage, both times they accelerated the note on a drought and loss basis shortly before the property sold for below market value. He paused. I am not in a position to tell you that's fraud rather than coincidence. Not yet. But you're looking, Cole said. I've been looking, Slade said. At the bank? At Hargrove? At the land transfers. I have been looking for 6 months and getting nowhere because I had no physical evidence of mechanism. No way to explain how healthy properties were becoming distressed on schedule. He looked at Clara. That's what you gave me. The mechanism. She thought about her father sitting on that hill country porch with his notebooks. She thought about the feel of the earth under her hands at the base of the ridge. She thought about a water engineer named Fitch, dead now, who had understood exactly what he was doing when he buried those timbers. Then we have 31 days left on the note, she said. How long do you need? Slade looked at Taft. Taft said nothing, which seemed to be its own kind of answer. I'll do what I can, Slade said. Bisab. The trouble came 8 days later, and it came fast. Clara was in the main barn at mid-morning when she heard the wagon in the yard and stepped out to see 2 men she didn't recognize climbing down from it. Not Slade's type, not Hargrove's investment company type. These were working men, big through the chest, with the specific blankness of expression that came from being paid to arrive somewhere and be convincing about it. Behind them came a man in a suit carrying a leather case. He was somewhere in his 40s, with a neat beard and a manner of moving that suggested he was accustomed to people making room for him. Cole came out of the house. Cole Mercer? The suited man said. That's right. My name is Aldred. I represent a coalition of landholders in Harlow County. I'm here on behalf of the County Agricultural Assessment Board. He opened his case and produced a sheaf of papers. We have a court-authorized order to conduct a property assessment of Redstone Ranch to be completed within 48 hours pursuant to the outstanding debt proceedings initiated by First Commercial of Lubbock. Clara had come to stand near Cole. She read the documents over his shoulder quickly. Real court seal, real judge's signature, date of 3 days ago. Cole looked at Aldred. And if I decline? The assessment proceeds regardless. The court order authorizes entry. Aldred said it without heat or apology. This is a standard procedure in cases of default risk. The note hasn't defaulted. It has 31 days remaining, Mr. Mercer, and the property value assessment is required to proceed before that deadline. Aldred looked around the yard with the evaluating look of a man pricing things. We'll be as unobtrusive as possible. Cole looked at Clara. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Not now, not here, not in front of these men. Fine, Cole said. Dub will show you around. After Aldred and the two large men had gone with Dub, Clara pulled Cole back into the house. That assessment is going to come back low, she said. Whatever number they put on this property, it'll justify the bank calling the full note early. The assessment is the mechanism for the final step. Cole sat down heavily. Can we challenge it? We can, but challenges take time and lawyers, and we have 31 days. She thought fast. Send for Slade. Today. Tell him what's happening. The assessment order. If we can show it's connected to Hargrove, if the judge who signed it has any relationship with Hargrove's people, that's a serious accusation. Everything about this is serious. She looked at him. Do you trust Slade? I think so, yes. Then get word to him now. Don't wait to see what the assessment says. She paused. And Cole, while those men are on this property, I want someone watching what they do. Not following them, obviously. Just aware. He sent Peso. Peso spent the next 2 days at a careful distance from Aldred and his associates, doing ordinary ranch work in the areas they happened to be assessing. He had good instincts about appearing occupied while paying attention, which Clara had noticed early. He reported back each evening. The first evening, Aldred had spent a long time at the East Pasture, photographing the excavation sites and making notes. He'd asked Dub questions about when the digging had occurred. Dub had said he didn't know exactly, that it was ongoing maintenance work. The second evening, one of the large men had gone to the South Corral alone, without Aldred, and had spent time near the intake valve of the contaminated trough. He hadn't touched anything. He'd just looked. Then he'd walked the fence line slowly, measuring something with a cord. Clara wrote all of it down. When Slade arrived the following morning, he'd ridden through the night after Cole's message reached him. She handed him Peso's report alongside her own notes on the assessment order. She'd spent the previous evening researching the judge whose name appeared on the order. The judge had signed 3 previous property assessment orders in the past 5 years, all involving properties that subsequently sold to Hargrove-connected entities within 8 months. Slade read through everything with his traveling expression, that constant, unhurried movement of the eyes. When he finished, he set the papers down and was quiet for a moment. The judge may be innocent, he said. Assessment orders are routine. He may have signed this without understanding the context. I know that. But the pattern of his signature appearing in 3 prior cases is either remarkable coincidence or it isn't, Clara said. Slade almost smiled. It was a very small almost. I'm going to need to move faster than I'd planned. He looked at Cole. The warrant applications for the Alderman and Kelton properties. I was waiting for additional corroboration. I don't have time to wait anymore. He turned back to Clara. The man who went to the South Corral alone. Can Peso identify him in a formal statement? Yes. Will he? Yes. Slade nodded. He picked up the papers and squared them against the table edge. Here is where we are. I have enough for the warrant applications. I'm going to file them today and ride to Lubbock tonight. If the warrants are granted and we find comparable constructions on the other properties, and I believe we will, then I have what I need to bring federal fraud charges. He looked at both of them. That process will take time, more time than 31 days. The room went very quiet. What happens to the ranch? Cole said. I can petition the court to freeze the note proceedings pending the fraud investigation. A judge at the federal level, not the county level, can issue a stay on the bank's enforcement action. He paused. I cannot guarantee that succeeds. I can tell you I'll make the argument. Cole nodded. His face had the look of a man holding himself very level while the ground moved under him. Make the argument, he said. The attempted destruction came 2 nights later at 2 in the morning. Clara woke to the smell of smoke. She was out of the bunkhouse before she was fully awake, and the smell hit her properly in the open air. Not wood smoke, not cook fire, something chemical underneath it. And she ran toward the second barn, which was where it was coming from. The east wall was burning. Not fully. The fire was maybe 10 minutes old, climbing the dry siding, and the wind was wrong for them, pushing it toward the interior where feed and equipment were stored. She shouted and kept shouting, and by the time Cole came running from the house, Peso and Walt were already there with the water buckets. They fought it for 40 minutes. It was not graceful. It was buckets and shouting, and at one point Walt went into the barn and came back out with his coat sleeve burning, and Hatch knocked him down and rolled him in the dirt. And Walt said something extremely profane, and Hatch said something back, and they both went back to work. The fire went out. The east wall was badly damaged, but the barn was standing. Clara stood in the yard afterward, covered in smoke and sweat, and looked at the base of the burned wall where the fire had started. In the light of the lanterns they'd brought out, she could see the scorch pattern. Not accidental, not a lantern tipped, not a coal from the fire pit. The burn pattern at the base was circular and accelerated. Someone had set it deliberately, used an accelerant, and knew what they were doing. She got down on her knees and looked at the ground near the base of the wall, at the edge of where the fire had been. There was a partial boot print in the soft earth. She found a board from the damaged wall and placed it carefully over the print. In the morning, she showed it to Slade, who had still been on the property preparing his warrant applications when the fire started and had helped carry buckets. He photographed the boot print and the scorch pattern and the burn origin. He was methodical and unhurried despite having been awake since 2 a.m, and when he finished, he stood and said, "This is arson. That's a separate criminal charge, separate from the fraud case. Whoever did this may not have thought through that distinction." "They wanted to destroy the documentation," Clara said. "The barn is where we'd moved the sample boxes." "Did it work?" "No, I moved everything to the house 4 days ago, after the assessment team came." Slade looked at her. "Why?" "Because I thought if they knew what we had, they might try to take it." She paused. "The barn seemed like the obvious place to look, so I moved it to the obvious place not to look, which is under the floorboard in the kitchen behind the stove." He studied her for a moment. "You've been thinking about this as an operational problem." "I've been thinking about it as a problem where someone who knows this land better than I'd like has been trying to stay 2 steps ahead of us." She looked at the burned wall. "The arson means we got close enough that they stopped being careful." "Sloppy moves leave traces," Slade said. "Yes, so I need everything from last night. The boot print, the scorch analysis, witness accounts of when the fire started, anything anyone saw or heard before it." She turned to him. "And I need you to file those warrants today. Not tonight. Today." He looked at her with that measuring quality that she'd gotten used to over the past week. A man taking someone's measure and revising upward. "Yes," he said. "Today." The warrants were granted 3 days later. Slade sent word by telegraph from Lubbock, and when Cole read the message aloud at the supper table, Hatch closed his eyes for a moment and Peso exhaled audibly, and Walt just nodded, jaw tight, like a man confirming something he'd been afraid to believe. The federal investigation was now formally open. On the Alderman property, Hargrove's land on the east side of the ridge, investigators found 2 barrier constructions within the first 2 days. On the Kelton property, which Hargrove also controlled, they found 3, one of which was still intact and actively diverting water. 3 ranches, 9 barriers total. A pattern so consistent it could not have been coincidental, executed with the same engineering signature, the same technique, the same materials, the same understanding of subsurface hydraulics, across properties spanning nearly 60 square miles. The warrant for Hargrove's financial records came through on a Tuesday. Slade telegraphed that same day. The financial records showed payments to a subsidiary of Fitch's former employer dated within months of each property's water failure. The subsidiary was dissolved 2 years ago, but the payment records survived. Clara read the telegraph twice and then sat very still for a moment, feeling something move through her that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite triumph, and was more like the feeling you got when you'd been carrying something for a very long time and someone finally helped you set it down. The federal stay on the bank proceedings came through on Thursday, 18 days before the note deadline. A federal judge in Fort Worth signed it on the basis of the ongoing fraud investigation, ordering First Commercial of Lubbock to suspend all enforcement actions against Redstone Ranch pending the investigation's conclusion. Cole read that document alone in his office. She didn't go in. Some moments were private. When he came out, he didn't say anything immediately. He went to the water pump in the yard and worked the handle and washed his face and stood there for a moment with the water dripping off his jaw. Then he said, to no one in particular, to the yard in the afternoon and the ridge visible in the distance, "All right." Arrest warrants for Dallard Hargrove and 2 associates were issued the following week. Hargrove was taken into federal custody on a Wednesday morning at his office in Lubbock. He did not, according to Slade's subsequent report, say much. His lawyers said a great deal. The man named Carver, Walt's visitor, the one who'd assessed the South Corral before coming back to poison it, was identified and arrested in Abilene 4 days later. The boot print from the barn matched his left boot, which the arresting deputies noted fit so precisely it was almost as though someone had been careful to preserve it. Birch was located in Midland. He had, in fact, been visiting his sister. He had also been paid $400 by an intermediary connected to Hargrove's operation in exchange for information about the ranch's layout and timeline. He was arrested on a Sunday morning and, according to Slade's later account, cried for most of the interview. Clara felt something when she heard that. Not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it. The understanding that small, desperate men got used by larger operations, and the using didn't excuse the choice, but it explained the shape of it. She put that aside and kept working. The water came back properly in the 3rd week of October. Clara was at the East Ridge at dawn, as she often was, when she heard it before she saw it. A sound she almost didn't recognize at first, low and continuous, the sound of water moving over rock. She walked along the base of the ridge to the northern point where the channel emerged, and there it was, a thin but definite flow, running along the old bed of Redley Creek, cutting through the dried silt, moving south along the base of the sandstone. It was not dramatic. It was maybe 2 inches of water in a channel that had once held 2 feet. But it was running. It was running on its own, the way it had always been supposed to run, finding the path that had been cut for it over decades or centuries, working its way back into the land that had been waiting for it. She watched it for a long time. When she got back to the yard, Cole was at the corral fence, looking toward the ridge. He'd heard it too, she thought, or seen something in her face when she came back. "Redley Creek," she said. He looked at her. "It's running," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he turned and looked toward the east pasture and the ridge beyond it, and the morning light was coming sideways over the hill, and the dried grass along the creek bed caught it and looked for a moment almost golden. "My father built this place," he said. Not to her particularly. "Before I bought it, the previous owners, going back to the family that first put up the fence posts and dug the well. They built it over 20 years. He paused. "Someone spent 9 of mine trying to take it apart piece by piece." She stood beside him at the fence. "They didn't finish," she said. He looked at her. The morning was cool, the air carrying the smell of damp earth for the first time in longer than she'd been here. The cattle in the North Corral were moving differently. Still thin, still recovering, but something in their movement had changed, the particular restless misery of animals without enough water replaced by something calmer. "No," he said. "They didn't finish." She thought about everything she'd written in the margins of her father's notebooks over the past weeks. She thought about the false survey, and the buried timbers and the contaminated trough, and the fire and the assessment men in their suits measuring a property they'd already decided the value of. She thought about Hargrove in federal custody and Carver's boot matching the print she'd preserved under a board in the dark at 2 a.m. She thought about 37 days ago, stepping off a coach in Harlow with 2 bags and a piece of folded paper that said no references required. "I need to write to Adler," she said. "He'll want to know the water came back. He'll want to know you were right. He already knew that." She picked up her notebook from the fence post where she'd set it. "I'm going to walk the creek line, see how far it's running." "I'll come," Cole said. They walked together along the base of the ridge in the early morning, following the thin line of water south through the dry grass, and the creek ran ahead of them, unhurried and indifferent, going where it had always been going, as though the past 9 years had been a minor interruption in something that intended to continue regardless. The federal trial of Dallard Hargrove began in Fort Worth on the 14th of February, and Clara was there for every day of it. She had not planned to attend every session. She had planned to give her testimony, answer questions, and return to the ranch where there was still considerable work to be done. But Slade had asked her to stay, and when she understood why, that Hargrove's defense was going to challenge the credibility of the physical evidence at every turn, and that she might be called back to the stand more than once, she agreed. Cole came for the first week and the last, and in between he was at the ranch managing the recovery operation, which needed managing. Peso sent letters every few days, written in his cramped, effortful hand, reporting on the cattle numbers and the creek levels in the state of the East Pasture. She stayed at a boarding house 3 blocks from the federal courthouse, a narrow room on the second floor with a window that looked out on a delivery alley. She ate breakfast early and walked to the courthouse and sat in the gallery and watched and listened, and in the evenings she went back to the boarding house and wrote in her notebook. The defense was good. She had expected that. Hargrove had 4 lawyers, and the lead one was a man named Pressler, who had the kind of courtroom ease that came from winning cases that should have gone the other way. He challenged provenance, challenged chain of custody, challenged the credibility of Adler's independent assessment, challenged the interpretation of Peso's uncle's testimony. He argued that the barrier constructions could have been the work of previous landowners, that the fraudulent survey might reflect the negligence of the false firm rather than Hargrove's direction, that no direct documentary link existed between Hargrove personally and the construction of anything on anyone's property. He was not wrong that the direct link was the weakest part, but the financial records were harder to argue away. Slade's team had traced the payments through 3 subsidiary companies, each one a thin shell barely substantial enough to qualify as a business entity. And at the end of that chain were payments to the account of the firm that had employed Fitch in the years the barriers were constructed. The payments corresponded, within weeks, to the dates of water failure on each of the 3 affected ranches. And then there was the pattern itself. 9 barriers across 3 properties, constructed with identical technique, achieving identical results, benefiting one entity, Dallard Hargrove's land acquisition operation. Pressler argued coincidence until it became apparent the jury was doing the arithmetic and arriving at the same answer everyone else had arrived at. After the 3rd day of financial testimony, Clara watched Pressler whisper something to Hargrove during a recess, and she watched Hargrove's jaw tighten, and she understood that they were having the conversation that defendants had with their lawyers when the math stopped working in their favor. She was called back to the stand twice. The second time, Pressler spent 40 minutes trying to establish that her findings had been influenced by personal financial motivation, that she was a paid employee of Cole Mercer and therefore had reason to find what she found. "You're suggesting," she said, "that I identified 4 buried barrier constructions, calculated their hydraulic effect, connected them to a pattern of property acquisition, and anticipated a fraudulent survey, all in order to protect a job I'd held for 11 days. There was a sound from the gallery. The judge did not gavel it down. Pressler moved on. Hargrove was convicted on 11 counts of federal fraud, 2 counts of criminal conspiracy, and 1 count of accessory to arson. His 2 associates received lesser sentences. The man named Carver, who had poisoned the water and set the barn fire, received the longest sentence of the associates, 15 years, because the arson charge carried weight and because the prosecution had his boot print preserved under a board in the dark by a woman who'd been awake at 2 a.m. and thinking ahead. Birch received 2 years for his cooperation with Hargrove's operation, reduced from a heavier charge because he had provided information during the investigation that helped establish the payment chain. Clara heard about the reduction and felt the same complicated thing she'd felt when she heard he'd cried during the interview. She did not think 2 years was enough. She also understood that the justice system was not designed to match the shape of her feelings, and that the information Birch provided had mattered, and she put it in the category of things she could not fix and moved on. First Commercial of Lubbock was separately investigated, and 2 of its senior officers were indicted on charges of participating in a coordinated scheme to manipulate property values and accelerate debt collection in furtherance of Hargrove's acquisitions. The bank itself was placed under federal oversight. Cole's note was voided in its entirety as an instrument of fraud, which meant that Redstone Ranch carried no outstanding debt to an institution that no longer had the legal standing to collect it. She was in the boarding house when Slade told her that last part by telegraph. She read the message 3 times. Then she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked out the window at the delivery alley, at a man unloading crates from a wagon in the cold morning light, and she thought about what it meant to fight for something over a long time without knowing whether the fight would amount to anything. Her father had not gotten his land back. He had been right about what had been done to him, and it had not mattered, because being right and being able to prove it in a way that compelled action were 2 completely different things, separated by resources and relationships and luck and timing. He had been right, and he had been poor, and he had lost anyway. She thought about that for a while. Then she packed her bag and went home. Spring came to Redstone Ranch with the particular generosity of land that has been water-starved. Everything at once, and slightly excessive about it. Redley Creek ran properly by March, 2 feet of clear water moving south along the base of the East Ridge, carving its old course back into the silt. The East Pasture, which had been the worst ground on the ranch when Clara arrived, greened up faster than any of them expected. Adler had written that the subsurface moisture had been present all along, held below the surface by the blockage, and once the channel was restored, the root systems that hadn't died, only gone dormant, found the water and responded. The grass came back from the inside of the ground rather than from seed, which meant it was denser and more established than new growth would have been. The cattle recovered. Not all of them. 4 of the 6 that had been poisoned in the South Corral trough did not fully recover, and 1 died in January despite the vet's efforts and Cole's. That one death bothered him in a way that the others had not, because by January the crisis was largely over and he'd allowed himself to believe the worst was behind them, and then it wasn't. She did not try to talk him out of grieving it. Some losses stayed at their own weight regardless of the context around them, but the herd grew. Cole had modest capital, freed by the notes voiding and by a settlement payment that came as part of the fraud judgment, and he invested it carefully, buying young stock in the spring and leasing additional pasture from the Garrity family 2 miles east, whose patriarch had watched the Redstone situation unfold and decided he liked the direction it was moving. By May, the cattle numbers had more than doubled from what they'd been when Clara arrived. By August, they'd tripled. Cole was careful about it, careful in a way he hadn't had the luxury to be before, when survival had made every decision feel urgent. Now he could think in seasons rather than days. He was better at it than he'd have admitted, and she told him so. "I know how to run cattle," he said, slightly defensive, which made her laugh. "I know you do. I'm saying you're good at it." He looked at her sideways. "Is that a compliment or a surprise?" "Both," she said, which was honest. 10. The neighboring ranchers started coming around in early summer. The first was Garrity himself, the patriarch, a deliberate old man named Horace, who drove out in a wagon with his son and looked at the East Pasture for a long time without saying much, and then said to Clara, "I heard you found the water by reading the grass." "Partly," she said, "and my father's notebooks." "What else?" She thought about it, paying attention to things that didn't add up. Horace looked at the East Pasture again. "My north boundary runs dry every August, has for 8 years. He looked at her. "I always figured it was the drought." "It might be," she said, "but it might not be." She paused. "I could walk it with you if you wanted. Have a look." She walked Horace Garrity's north boundary on a Thursday afternoon and found nothing. No barrier, no construction, just a natural drainage shift caused by sediment accumulation over years. She told him so, and told him how to address it, and drew him a diagram of where to redirect and how. He thanked her without making a large event of it, which she appreciated. He sent his son to help with the redstone fence repair the following week. He didn't say that was why the son came, but that was why. After Garrity came Beaumont, whose property was 3 miles west and who had water questions of a different kind. He wanted to know if there was a way to improve the yield of a failing well without drilling a new one. After Beaumont came a woman named Ida Marsh, recently widowed, who was trying to hold her husband's ranch together with 2 grown sons who didn't agree on much, and a third who had left for the city. Clara spent an afternoon at Ida's kitchen table going through the ranch's accounting and making suggestions that were practical rather than brilliant. Trim this, extend that timeline. The situation is bad, but it's not the kind of bad that doesn't have a path through it. Ida looked at the papers Clara had organized and said, "Where did you learn all this?" "Some of it from my father, the rest from watching what almost happened here." Clara paused. "And from understanding that most things that look like natural failures aren't entirely natural. They have causes, and causes can be addressed." Ida looked at her for a moment. She was a lean, weathered woman in her 60s with the posture of someone who had been holding things together by physical will for so long it had become her default position. "I heard about what you did at Redstone. The whole county heard. The county heard a simplified version. They heard a woman came in and figured out what nobody else had figured out and saved a ranch that was dying." Ida folded her hands on the table. "That's not simplified. That's just what happened." Clara didn't argue. Cole brought the partnership up in September, and he did it badly, which was actually the thing that made her believe he meant it. They were at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd sorted his records in the dark before dawn months ago. The same table where Slade had spread the documentation and taken it apart and put it back together. And he had a piece of paper in front of him that he kept not looking at, which told her he was nervous, which was interesting. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the operation, going forward." He still wasn't looking at the paper. "The water rights situation is going to take another 6 months to fully resolve legally. The Kelton and Alderman properties are in federal receivership, and there are water rights questions that Slade says need to settle before anyone can make full use of the creek downstream." He paused. "But when that settles, this land is going to be worth significantly more than it was, and the herd is growing, and the Garrity lease is probably going to convert to a purchase. He's dropping hints that way." She waited. "The thing is," he said, and then stopped. "Cole, I can't run this alone." He said it at the table rather than at her, which she suspected was easier for him. "I couldn't run it alone before. I was failing at it alone, which is how we got here. And I could hire more men, and I probably will, but that's not—" He finally looked at her. "What I'm saying is that what you do here isn't ranch hand work. It hasn't been for a long time. What you do here is you run this place. You think about it the way I think about it, except you think about it better." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about it differently," she said. "Not better." "Clara, what are you asking exactly?" He picked up the paper and turned it to face her. It was a draft, handwritten, clearly his own work, not a lawyer's, of a partnership agreement. Her name was on it beside his. Equal operational authority, equity stake, structured as accumulating over 5 years. Decision-making shared on all matters above a modest threshold. Her name on the property as a working partner. She looked at it for a long time. "You had a lawyer look at this?" she said. "No, I wrote it myself. If you're interested, then I'll have a lawyer look at it." She looked up at him. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had committed to something and was now waiting to find out what that cost. "Why?" she said. "There are men who've been in this work for 20 years. You could hire someone with a reputation." "I could. I have no reputation. I showed up with 2 bags and my father's notebooks." "You have a reputation now," he said. "Whether you've noticed or not, you have one." She thought about Ida Marsh at her kitchen table. She thought about Horace Garrity looking at the east pasture. She thought about Slade saying you're the first person to dig up his methodology in that dry measuring tone. "It would change things," she said. "Between us." "Yes," he said. "It would." She looked at the draft again. She thought about the job posting she'd folded into her coat pocket in that rented room in Abilene. No references required. She thought about what she'd been running from and what she'd run toward and whether she'd known the difference at the time. She hadn't. She just needed somewhere to go that would let her work. But this was not just somewhere anymore. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his face shifted. Relief, she thought, though he kept it restrained. "All right. My name goes on the water rights documentation, not just the operational agreement. When the Redley Creek rights resolve, I'm on record as a rights holder." "Done." The East Pasture decisions are mine. You can advise, but the East Pasture is where I found this thing, and I'm not going to manage it by committee. I wasn't going to argue about the East Pasture. And I'm bringing Peso into a formal position. He's been doing the work of someone in a formal position for months. Cole looked at her. That I agree with. I was going to do that anyway. She looked at the draft one more time, her name on a piece of paper next to his. On land she'd arrived at knowing no one, land she'd read with her hands and her father's notebooks and her own stubborn refusal to accept that things that didn't add up were just the way things were. Give it to a lawyer, she said. Have them clean it up, and add the water rights clause. Cole nodded. He picked up the draft. He didn't smile, so he wasn't much of a smiler. But something in his posture changed, the same way it had changed the morning they'd walked Redley Creek together in the October light. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. I'm getting equity. But the partnership papers were signed in October, on the 1-year anniversary of the water coming back. They didn't make an occasion of it. Cole had work. Clara had work. And the lawyer came out from Harlow in the morning, and they signed at the kitchen table, and the lawyer witnessed it and left. And then they went back to work. But in the late afternoon, when the light was going golden and long across the East Pasture and the creek was audible from the yard, a sound she had stopped noticing until she realized she would miss it if it stopped, Clara walked out to the base of the ridge by herself. The East Pasture was transformed. Not dramatically, not overnight. It had taken a year of patient recovery, and there were still sections where the grass was thin and the soil needed more time. But the overall change was undeniable. The ground was different. The color was different. The cattle that grazed there moved with the ease of animals that had enough. She stood at the place where she'd first put her hand in the earth and felt the dampness, the night she'd come out alone with a lantern after supper. The sandstone above her was the same. The hawk that hunted along the ridge was the same, or one that had taken its place. The creek ran a few feet away, clear and unhurried. She opened her father's notebook, the third one, the one she'd been writing in herself for the past year, his old entries on the left pages and hers on the right, a conversation across time she hadn't planned but had fallen into. And she looked at the sketch she'd made that first week, the rough drawing of the East Pasture, the ridge line, the grass pattern with its interrupted drainage, the notation. Something doesn't add up. Something had not added up, and she had kept looking until it did. She thought about what that meant, not for herself, but as a principle. She had grown up watching her father believe that the earth told the truth, if you paid attention, and she had spent years half believing that and half thinking it was a poetic way of saying something simpler. But it wasn't a metaphor. It was literal. The grass grew where water went, the soil compacted where it had been wet and dried too fast. The patterns were there. They were always there. Most people didn't look because they'd already accepted an explanation, and an accepted explanation was the end of looking. Her father had lost his land because he couldn't prove what he knew. She had proved what she knew because she'd refused to accept that knowing and proving were different countries with no road between them. You built the road. You documented, you measured, you found people who could certify what you'd found, you thought about what the other side would argue, and you answered those arguments before they were made. You moved faster when they tried to slow you down. You preserved the boot print in the dark, and even then it wasn't clean. 4 cattle she couldn't save. Birch, who had sold them out and gotten 2 years for it, which would never feel adequate. The Alderman and Kelton families, who had been through the same thing before Redstone, and who would not get their land back because it was in federal receivership and would be sold, and the money would go somewhere legal and impersonal and not to them. Justice was real, but it was partial, and it arrived late and brought paperwork, and that was what it was. She had not saved everyone. She had saved this. And this, she thought, looking at the pasture, at the water, at the fence line that ran where it was supposed to run. This was not nothing. Horace Garrity had told her on one of his visits that people in the county were calling Redstone the ranch that came back. She'd told him she didn't love that framing. He'd asked why. She'd said, "It didn't come back. It was brought back. There's a difference." Came back suggests it happened on its own. It didn't. People fought for it specifically, on purpose, at cost. That should be part of the story. Garrity had looked at her for a moment and then said, "You're going to be a difficult neighbor." "Probably," she'd said. He'd laughed, and she'd liked him better for it. Marche. Cole found her at this ridge as the sun was going down, which had become, without either of them deciding it, a kind of habit. He came out when there was light left and stood where she was standing, or somewhere near it, and they talked about the ranch or didn't talk at all, and the day ended. Garrity's son came by, he said. I saw his horse. He wants to know if you'd consult on their north boundary again in the spring. Says his father found the sediment work you suggested and did half of it last fall and the water improved already. It should improve more in the spring. He's offering to pay. She looked at him. What did you tell him? I said I'd pass it along. She turned back to the creek. The water was catching the last of the light, moving in that unhurried way it had, as though it had time, as though it had always had time, and the past 9 years had been an interruption, it had simply waited out. Tell him yes, she said. Same terms as the Beaumont work. Cole nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same water. There's talk, he said, that 2 ranches in Briscoe County had similar water problems over the past decade. Similar pattern. Slade mentioned it to me last week. He thinks the investigation may expand. She had known this was coming. You did not build a methodology as careful as Hargrove's for one county. You used it where you could, for as long as you could, until someone dug it up. If Slade needs me, I'll go, she said. I know you will. He paused. I'm not trying to keep you here. I know that too. They stood together in the cooling air, and the creek ran, and the cattle in the east pasture moved through the long grass with the slow ease of animals that had enough. The ridge behind them was the same as it had always been. Old sandstone, layered, holding the memory of every season it had witnessed. She had come here with 2 bags and her father's notebooks, and nowhere left to go. And what she had found was not what she'd been looking for, because she hadn't been looking for anything specific. She just needed ground to stand on. And the ground had given her what it always gave, if you were willing to listen. The truth, patient and exact, already there, waiting for someone to stop accepting the explanation they'd been handed and start looking for the one that added up. She looked at the east pasture. She looked at the creek. She looked at the name on the partnership papers she'd signed that morning. Her name, next to his, on land she'd read with her hands in the dark. She was not the woman who had no family. She was not the woman with nowhere to go. Those were facts about a version of herself that still existed somewhere. But they were not the whole truth anymore, and they were getting less true by the season. The ground was still talking. She was still listening. That, she thought, was enough. More than enough. It was the whole thing.